and what you have achieved. Sorry for the interruption.
That's all right.
Has started now. Yeah, so for us, also for Michi and me, it was a great pleasure to dig into this topic, and also to think about your life both together, and a huge respect. You know, I have 3 siblings, and we still fight for the food. So huge respect to you that you managed to creating such amazing work. And yeah.
Well, my siblings don't live here. It might have been harder if they did.
That's maybe that's the secret, yeah.
Yeah.
Work with
Keep the
parents
siblings away.
Amazing. And yeah, we have prepared some questions for you, and if okay for you, we would just jump straight into it.
Sure.
And imagine someone doesn't know Ed, which is in this round, it's not the case, but imagine, how would you describe him?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of his personality ends up sort of embodied in his work. And the first thing I'd say is very attentive. You know, he's a social scientist, and you know, social scientists are, at least in our view, are acutely aware of what's happening with the people around them. That's what distinguishes a great anthropologist. Obviously, it's what, you know, distinguishes a great psychotherapist. But in his case, it was more interest in what was happening in the family unit or in the team at work, or so that attentiveness to how is this group of human beings interacting with each other, and you know, how can I learn what's going on in order to help people? So that sort of that attentive and fundamentally curious about how people interact with each other. The other thing that I would say is that he, I think he was fundamentally non-judgmental. That his view was if a judgment needs to be made about a piece of work or a comment or something like that, it's up for the person who owns it to make the judgment. He never wanted to be in the position of saying whether it was right or wrong. He wanted to help you figure out whether it was right or wrong. So there's an accepting, non-judgmental side of things that, of course, you know, was good as a kid. You know, if you cross the line, he's going to let you know. But generally, he wanted me to figure out what was right and what was wrong. And, you know, guardrails, but not a lot of rules. And yeah, that's partly because I grew up in the 70s. But, you know, I think that was a nice model for me to be, when I became a father, to think about how can you guide without restricting. So, and a lot of that was, you know, to suspend judgment. And obviously this carried through into his career as a consultant. His job was never to go in and make judgments. His job was to go in and help people figure out on their own and for their own teams and groups what was right and what was wrong.
That sounds very empowering as well, and inspiring when you're thinking about yourself and how to, you know, develop yourself, and empowering. And this supportive environment is a luxury, I think, everyone may want to have for their own life. And
right. Now, you know, he grew up with Prussian and Eastern European parents. So it wasn't, and both of whom were physicists. So it wasn't without some discipline, you know, that was also part of the game. But, you know, a velvet hammer, as we say, that's not a bad way to grow up. Or, you know, padded guardrails. I knew what the rules were. He didn't let me go without any rules. But he wasn't particularly harsh and judgmental if I broke them. Because if I broke them, he figured I probably knew I broke them.
I see, I see. And from your point of view, what are Ed's most enduring ideas over the decades?
Sure. I wrote a few down. Thank you for sending these questions so that I could think a little bit about them, because this one in particular. So I think the first thing that stands out for me is process before expertise. Meaning, if you're a consultant and you're brought in to help a company figure something out, one approach, and there are many great consulting firms out there that are very good at developing a body of information, a body of data, and letting the data lead you to an answer, and presenting and providing that expertise, that answer to your client. That was not Ed's game. Ed's game was what's going on in this organization that needs this help to begin with. How are they going to figure out how to make the right decisions given the, the oscillations and perturbations that are upsetting the company enough to call in a consultant? And so the idea of process really goes to the broader idea of how do you bring people along, how do you help people? And it starts with asking rather than telling. Okay, so, and and this also touches on another key idea, that everything is in an intervention. So that first conversation that you have with a prospective employer or a new boss or a new client, if you're a consultant, is how are you going to present yourself in a way that draws them closer to you, rather than presenting information that they may or may not accept. You want them to accept you as a helper, not necessarily to accept your expertise. I think another thing that was important to Ed was this carrying on the work of Douglas McGregor and this notion of theory Y. And theory Y being that people are inherently good, they want to be at work, they want to do things for the benefit of a company, and they're not just there for a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. They are intrinsically engaged, and the mission of or one of the missions of the organization is to keep those people engaged. They wouldn't be there, they wouldn't want to go to work if they didn't have some of that internal motivation. And that's what theory Y is all about. What Ed and I spent a lot of time over the last few years trying to articulate is the difference between transactional relationships at work and personal relationships at work. And the idea of the word we coined, personizing, creating what we call level 2 relationships at work, is an attenuation of theory Y. So if anybody wants to go back and read some of the history about Douglas McGregor and theory X and theory Y, I tend to view that distinction between transactional relationships in our professional lives versus personal relationships in our professional lives. With personal relationships, we get to theory Y. It's much harder if we are maintaining transactional relationships. That's a big topic. We may get to it later, but as succinctly as I could capture that. Another one that I think comes up with Ed sometimes, is the idea of being very wary when somebody asks you for advice. For two reasons. Are they asking you for advice? You don't know. They're asking you for something, and they're presenting it to you as, I need some advice. But you don't really know, what they need until you start asking them what they need. And so as advisors, we need to be very careful when somebody asks us for advice. We need to step back and say, yeah, but what's really going on? What's going on, personally? What's going on professionally? What's this hard problem that you're struck with? And the problem with advice is that if you get it wrong, then you've messed up the relationship. Whereas if you try to get at what's really going on with them, of which the "I need your advice" question is really just that's a thin veneer. You need to figure out what's really going on when somebody asks you for advice. And then the other one that I want to add, and this comes directly from the Kurt Lewin axiom, that you can't really understand a group or a system or an organization or a problem until you try to change it. That in order to see all of the different dimensions, all of the different gears in the machine, you have to try to change it in order to really understand all of those gears and how they interact. And that leads to the other point that was so important to Ed, and I'll end with this one, is that change is a skill set. It's not an outcome. I know this is an overused phrase, but it is a journey, not a destination. Because the only point of changing the system is so that you can change it again, right? The point of creating change is not just that you're fixing that one thing, but it's so that you can fix other things down the road when they break, because they will. So change has to be thought of as developing a skill, not moving from point A to point B. So that's a long-winded answer, but
thanks a lot for that. Really, it was super insightful, and also thanks for drawing all the connections to all the other thinkers. Hello from my side as well, and I also want to continue with the question of enduring ideas. I think for a lot of students who study business, organizations, especially also in this room, they've heard about the 3-layer model, about the assumptions, about the values, and also about the artifacts. Now, this concept was created in the 80s, and we already heard that there's kind of an update for that earlier. Now, my question is, how is this concept still relevant today or in current times? What do you see there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason we would consider it relevant is that it's a vocabulary. It's not a model. It's not a toolbox. It's just a vocabulary to try to break down complicated problems. And one of the things that we did in the last few books is we tried to add that other dimension. That if you think about the artifacts, the espoused values, the underlying assumptions, that's sort of the original way to describe a culture that you observe. What we tried to add is now that other dimension of the culture that you practice or the culture that you experience. And this came partly from a great quote that's famously sort of hard to interpret, but I'll try to help you, from a social anthropologist in the 80s named Marshall Solins, who described how cultures evolve as a sort of continuous iteration or continuous evolution of the practice of the structure and the structure of the practice. And our point in emphasizing that is that on one hand, you've got the structure, which is that thing that you observe, those things, the artifacts in the break room, the what people say about their company. And then over time, you learn what are those sort of deeply held assumptions that can't be violated. But that's what an outsider might be able to interpret, or a new employee, or even a consultant working with a company. But for all of the people who work at that company, they're practicing this amorphous thing called their culture. They're practicing it every day as well. And the way you break down that practice is you think about what are the sort of the what we call the technical culture, meaning the stated strategy, mission, objectives that people live and breathe every day. And those might be good reflections of the underlying assumptions, or they might not be, because there may be a new CEO who's trying to change things. And so the technical culture is going to be explicitly changed. And then there's the social culture, which is how do people get along every day? And that might be very different from what people say about their company. They might say we're very, collaborative. And then somebody learns quickly that the practice of the culture isn't anywhere near as collaborative as they think it is. And then this all happens in the context of macro cultures, which could be occupational cultures. It could be, it could be the sort of geographic milieu. And of course, in Europe, that's fascinating because, there's Viennese culture, there's Germanic culture, there's EEC culture. There's so many different layers of macro culture that play in any given milieu. And again, in Europe, it's far more interesting than in the US. We've got a few regional cultures, but nothing like Europe, right? Which has few thousand years of cultural differentiation that makes places like the US seem kind of simple. So I guess the point is that just thinking of that culture observed without also trying to break down the culture experienced leaves you with only sort of seeing from one angle. And if you can start to describe what you're experiencing, then you've got a much more richly dimensional way of articulating what you're experiencing. So when somebody says we have a culture problem, you now have a vocabulary to try to break down what that is. Does it mean that we're treating each other like scientists when we're dealing with a problem that can't be dealt with that way? Or we say we're this, but everyday experience says we're something else. Our espoused values don't really line up with our the way that we interact, or they don't line up with what a new senior leader wants us to be doing. Having that vocabulary to try to break down where those gaps and disconnects are is what the whole notion about layered models of organizational culture is all about. But again, it's all about you interpreting your culture. It's not about us as outsiders trying to put things into a box. I'll share with you one more of my favorite quotes. And by the way, I was a social anthropology major in college. So this stuff is kind of the family business. It didn't come out of nowhere. I, with Ed's encouragement, studied this stuff in college and just, spent 30 years in Silicon Valley, but I never really put this stuff aside. This was always at the center of my thinking about problems. But so the sort of one of the great innovators in the field of cultural interpretation was Clifford Geertz, also in the 80s, who said the trick is to figure out what the devil they think they're up to. And so it's tricky. It's devilish because it's full of things that may be true or may be illusions. You don't know. And it's about what they think they're up to not about what you think they're up to. So you as an employee have to figure out what they think they're up to, because if you're new, you have to survive in that context. Or if you're in an opposing silo or an opposing division, you have to figure out what's motivating them. So these things aren't just sort of touchy-feely, they're very strategic. You have to figure out what they think they're up to in order to kind of move things along. And it doesn't help you just to put a label on it. You have to have what we think is a fairly rich vocabulary to start breaking these problems down.
Thank you. So really the vocabulary resonates with me a lot, because I'll celebrate my 10-year anniversary with my husband soon. So, and I see some similarities here as well to organizations. So it can be super helpful. Actually, also when it comes to culture, the leadership culture is always also a big topic, and is influencing the organizational culture. And in combination with good leadership, also this topic of humbleness and vulnerability is actually getting more and more important, which especially in Europe is still a bit of a topic which needs to be discussed. Based on your opinion and the humbleness series, what are the most important leadership skills of the future?
Well, I mean, in some respects, the most important and probably the hardest one is to accept that you don't know. You're a leader and you know as much as you know, and the group and the teams around you know more than you do. And, you might feel like you founded the company, you invented the chemical compound that the company is based on, or the microelectronics platform, whatever that is, whatever that intellectual property that you brought to the company, it was true that you knew everything when you started the company, but once you started scaling that company, what you know is limited to you, and your job as the leader is to draw out relevant information about everybody around you on your management team, or even down to the frontline employees. What do they know that's going to help you make better decisions? And how can you create a substrate of openness and trust in the organization so that facts on the ground, as they say, will trickle up and won't be sort of, paved over or subjugated because of political infighting within the organization. This truism that knowledge is power. Well, it's only power if you allow the knowledge to flow through the organization to the points where it can be acted on. So, I think that's what, in some respects, what humble leadership means to us is not that you as a leader are a, warm, humble, vulnerable person, but it's that you accept that there's more information around you that needs to be shared. And if you've created a situation where people are withholding information intentionally, or are scared to share information because it's bad news. Most of the time news is bad. If you're an innovator, most of the time you're facing problems more than you're facing great news and opportunity. That's what innovation's all about. So what does the leader do in embracing that humility to draw more information out and to try to assimilate in a way that it doesn't just become analysis paralysis? That's always a risk, but that's part of why maybe the second skill is for the leader to recognize when the process is starting to fall down, when the idea of we're going to create a system to share information. But if that turns into we're overwhelmed with information, we can't make decisions, then the leader has to recognize that point and say, all right, how are we going to break through these log jams? And sometimes that might mean, a tough, hard, lone decision by a leader. Most of the time, I don't think it does. I think it means you say, all right, we're taking a process break. This isn't working. Forget the problem at hand. The immediate problem is we're oversharing, or we're rabbit holing, or any of those problems that groups have when you try to make tough decisions. The leader has to be able to recognize that those moments need an intervention, not necessarily a decision, just an intervention that says, okay, process is broken. We need to fix the process before we solve the problem. And I guess I do want to sort of break down this idea of vulnerability, because in our mind, again, it doesn't have to mean anything about your personality. It just means you have to accept that you are vulnerable to what you don't know, and you're vulnerable to what people around you do know. And the way you deal with that vulnerability is you create that substrate of openness and trust, so that people will share information with you without it either seeming like it's to their advantage or a subject of retribution. So vulnerability, again, to me, is around information with which to make the best decisions. And you're vulnerable to what you don't know.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Yes. And this also, it's just coming to my mind what you mentioned at the beginning of, shifting from advisor role to listener role, which is, it's a big thing. It sounds easy with these 3 words, but actually it's a huge task, And I think I'm also thinking of the humble inquiry here, because it's, as we understood it, it's about asking such open questions to getting answers for questions you even haven't thought about. And I thought about, okay, how can I bring this mindset into my leadership team and transport it? So actually, it's a bit of a selfish question now to you. If you would give me advice how I can bring it into practice, what should I do, or what could I also share as advice? Here we are again with advising to my leadership team.
Well, I mean, I think one thing you're already onto, which is that key distinction of, it's not just about asking, it's about questions that you truly don't know the answer to. Because it's very easy to fall into either that pattern of sort of, you have a hunch and you're going to ask questions that lead your people to that hunch. Mm-hmm. Well, that's no better than telling them about your hunch, right? You're just leading them. You're directing them to your place rather than helping you find their place. Because what you want is you want to understand what they know. So again, asking those kinds of questions that you truly don't know the answer to is it's fundamental and it's hard. The other metaphor is crossing the net. It's so easy to sort of jump the net and start helping them rather than helping them figure it out for them on their own. And so asking questions that draw them out and give them the sense of they're helping and contributing, and B, give you the sense that that you're learning to work together. You're learning to learn together. We created this sort of this acronym or this metaphor called sharing the mic, and the mic being a microphone, but also it's an acronym. And it starts with the M, which is motivation. And so you have to bring a genuine motivation to understand where your team's at, or what they know about the problem you're trying to solve. It has to be a genuine curiosity. It can't just be, how am I going to feign questions in order to get them to see my point of view? You have to be motivated and curious to learn what they really are advocating or getting at or troubled by. The I in Mike is intervention. You also have to realize that you are intervening in their process. You're a leader. They have to attend to you. They have to respond to you. But that in itself is, you're touching their process. So you are intervening. And the only way you can really prove that not to be threatening is if you focus on deeply listening to what they're saying. So you're intervening with an open-ended question, but the process of intervention has to be about deeply listening to what they're saying and convincing people that that part of what you're doing is just listening. The C in share the mic is contribution, because you also have to recognize that in order for the group or you and that team to develop that openness and trust, they have to feel some contribution back from you. So you might share, something that is a problem or is perplexing, or something that will help them continue this cycle of contribution with each other. So it isn't just about asking questions. It's about this process of sharing the mic to build that level of connectedness, that level of openness and trust that will allow you to get to other parts of a conversation that you wouldn't get to otherwise if it was just all structured around questions leading to your answer or responses leading to their answer. You need to get to a common ground, and that's what our sharing the mic concept means.
Well, thanks a lot. With a look at the time, I'm already coming to my last question, and it's a question that kind of sums up what you just said, I think. So since we're all students and we maybe already in a leadership position in the future, and we're definitely going to have an influence on culture, in one sentence, what would be your most important advice for us for the future?
Well, I guess it would start with, and I learned this lesson from Ed very early on. I'm not here to give you advice. You all are going to have to figure it out for yourselves. And figuring out for yourselves is when your survival anxiety is greater than your learning anxiety. You can learn and learn and learn and learn, but when you really know that your career is on the line or your job's on the line, that survival anxiety is going to help you get through those tough patches. But I guess our challenge is to think about what you can benefit or how you can benefit by taking that kind of human-centric approach. Do not allow your relationships with other people at work or in prospective new positions to become transactional, professionally distanced, and arm's length relationships. Forge relationships that are personal enough. They don't have to be uncomfortable. We're never advocating, intimate necessarily, but how can you bring professional intimacy to your relationships so that you're building on the substrate of openness and trust? Because again, if you're trying to get a job with a new company, what's the one thing that they must have when they hire you? Well, they must trust you. So what are you going to do to build that openness and trust so that you're getting the straight scoop from them, and they trust you to either make the right decision and join a company, or accept that you're not the right fit. We often said if everybody in organizations are at this notion of level 2 of these personal connections in the key relationships, if you're at level 2, isn't it harder to contract, to lay people off? And our answer is no. It's not harder. It's actually easier, because you've established that trust, and people can share the problem that, we've got too many people in engineering working on that product that we're end of lifing. If they're just treated transactionally, those are harder layoffs to do. But if everybody is, feel like they trust the decisions that are going up and down the chain, then those kinds of layoff decisions, they're painful, but they're not it's tough love. It's not out of anger, or it doesn't create resentment. So anyway, that idea of bringing your whole person into prospective job situations, and focusing on building those personal connections, and not acting like an AI would at work, right? But all of this discussion about AI is replacing jobs. Well, that's if jobs are truly transactional, then AIs are going to be better than humans. But that's why you don't want those jobs, and you want to develop organizations that are not centered around those kinds of jobs. Unless you want to have an organization that's just you and a bunch of AIs, but I don't really think that's where we're headed. I think we're actually headed to developing organizations that are much more humanly centric than that. And I think Europe might be further along than the US in that regard. So.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. And especially with the last words about human-centered organizations. Yeah, thanks a lot for the conversation. Thanks a lot for the opportunity, for all those insights we got. Actually, for me, there were a lot of connections made. It was really insightful. I think there's a lot of takeaway. And yeah, again, really appreciate that.
Yeah, same on my side.
Good luck to everybody. Enjoy the summer, and on to new adventures for some of you, it sounds like, and embrace it. All of the struggle and the joy.
Thank you. Then handing back to Stefan.
Thank you. So first an applause. So hi Peter. I'm another guy facilitating our events today. I would really like to take the opportunity to thank you so much for your precious inputs, for your thoughts, for all the stories, for the sense of humor, and even vulnerability. So thank you very much, and goodbye from Vienna, and have a nice day.
Yes, and my pleasure, and thank you very much for inviting me. I want to give one shameless plug too, and that is that we are publishing a new edition of Humble Leadership this summer. And so much of what I've talked about is fresh off those pages. So it might be an easy way for people to go back and kind of recreate some of what I was saying in this session. So I'm sure it'll be translated into German, but then again, you all don't need that. The English will be out in August. So thank you.
Thank you.
Great
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Ja, großartig gemacht, wirklich, wenn ich das so spontan sagen darf. Vielen Dank für Ihre tollen Fragen. Perfekt vorbereitet, wirklich in die Tiefe gehen und man hat so wirklich das gesamte Spektrum kennengelernt über das Thema. Ja, bevor